Yo, supply under GST. Taxable event under GST supply. A taxable event is any transaction or occurrence that results in a tax consequence. Before levying any tax, taxable event needs to be ascertained. It is the foundation stone of any taxation system. It determines the point at which tax would be levied. Under the earlier indirect tax regime, the framework of taxable event in various statutes was prone to a catena of interpretations, resulting in litigation since decades. The controversy is largely related to issues like whether a particular process amounted to manufacture or not, whether the sale was predetermined sale, whether a particular transaction was a sale of goods or rendering of services, etc. The GST laws resolve these issues by laying down one comprehensive taxable event, that is supply. Supply of goods or services or both. Various taxable events, namely manufacture, sale, rendering of service, purchase, entry into a territory of state, etc., that existed prior to induction of GST, have been done away with in favor of just one event, that is supply. The GST law, by levying tax on supply of goods and or services, departs from the historically understood concepts of taxable events under the state VAT laws, excise laws, and service tax law, that is, sale, manufacture, and provision of services, respectively. In the GST regime, the entire value of supply of goods and or services is taxed in an integrated manner, unlike the earlier indirect taxes, which were charged independently either on the manufacture of sale of goods or on the provision of services. We'll skip the relevant definitions part and we'll directly go to the we will skip the definition of business. We'll just look at the definition of actionable claim. It means a claim to any debt other than a debt secured by mortgage of immovable property or by hypothecation or pledge of movable property, or to any beneficial interest in movable property not in the possession, either actual or constructive, of the claimant, which the civil courts recognize as affording grounds for relief, whether such debt or beneficial interest be existent, accruing, conditional, or contingent. Acha, the definition of person includes an individual, HUF, company, firm, trust, limited liability partnership, local authority, any association of persons or a body of individuals, whether incorporated or not in India or outside India, any corporation established by under any central, state, or provincial act or government company, any body corporate incorporated by or under the laws of a country outside India, central government and state government, a cooperative society registered under any law relating to cooperative societies, society as defined under the Societies Registration Act, every judicial, every artificial judicial person not falling above. Let's start with Section 7, Concept of Supply. The concept of supply is the keystone of the GST architecture. The provisions relating to the meaning and scope of supply are contained in Chapter 3 of the CGST Act, read with various schedules given under the said Act. Following sections and schedules shall be discussed in this chapter to understand the concept of supply. Section 7, 8. Uh, Section 7 says the meaning and scope of supply. Section 8 says the taxability of composite and mixed supplies. Schedule 1 are activities to be treated as supply even if made without consideration. Schedule 2 are activities or transactions to be treated as supply of goods or as supply of services. Schedule 3 are activities or transactions which shall be neither treated as supply of goods nor as supply of services. So, Section 7, Subsection 1. Supply includes all forms of supply of goods or services or both, such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, or disposal, made or agreed to be made for a consideration by a person in the course or furtherance of business. Clause AA. The activities or transactions by a person other than an individual to its members or constituents or vice versa for cash, deferred payment, other valuable consideration are also supply. Explanation: for the purposes of this clause, it is hereby clarified that notwithstanding anything contained in any other law for the time being in force or any judgment, decree, or order of any court, tribunal or authority, the person and its members or constituents shall be deemed to be two separate persons, and the supply of activities or transactions inter se shall be deemed to take place from one such person to another. Importation of services for a consideration whether or not in the course or furtherance of business, and the activities specified in Schedule 1 made or agreed to be made without a consideration. Where certain activities or transactions constitute a supply in accordance with the provisions of subsection 1, they shall be treated either as supply of goods or supply of services as referred to in Schedule 2. Notwithstanding anything contained in subsection 1, just a second. Activities, transactions specified in Schedule 3, or such activities or transactions undertaken by the central government, state government, or local authority in which they are engaged as public authorities as may be notified by the government on the recommendations of the council shall be treated neither as supply of goods nor as supply of services. And finally, subject to the provisions of subsections 1, 1A2, government may, on the recommendations of the council, specify by notification the transactions that are to be treated as a supply of goods and not as a supply of services, or a supply of services and not as a supply of goods. This was the Bayer Act. Now let's look into the analysis. The definition of supply as contained in Section 7 is an inclusive definition and does not define the term exhaustively. It defines the scope of supply in an inclusive manner. Clause A of subsection 1 illustrates the forms of supply, but the list is not exhaustive. This is further substantiated by the use of words such as in the definition. The meaning and scope of supply in terms of Section 7 can be understood in terms of the following parameters. Supply should be of goods or services. Supply should be made for a consideration. And supply should be made in the course or furtherance of business. So the parameters of supply are that supply should be in the course or furtherance of business, of goods and services, and for a consideration. Aforesaid parameters describe the concept of supply. However, there are a few exceptions to the second and third parameters, the requirement of supply being made for a consideration and in the course of furtherance of business in the GST law. Few exceptions have been carved out where a transaction is deemed to be a supply even without consideration, contained in Schedule 1 discussed later in this chapter. Similarly, the condition of supply to be made in the course or furtherance of business has been relaxed in case of import of services. Import of services for a consideration whether or not in the course or furtherance of business is treated as a supply. Further, there are also cases where a transaction is kept out of scope of supply despite the existence of the above parameters. There is a list of activities which are treated neither as supply of goods nor as a supply of services, which are contained in Schedule 3 to be discussed later. In other words, they are outside the scope of GST. Besides, GST law has clarified certain activities or transactions either as supply of goods or as supply of service, which are discussed in Schedule 2. Government is also empowered to notify transactions that are to be treated as a supply of goods and not as a supply of services, or as a supply of services and not as a supply of goods. In the subsequent paras, the above aspects of supply have been extensively discussed. The discussion has been broadly categorized into following. So, supply includes supply of goods or services for a consideration in the course or furtherance of business, activities or transactions between a person other than an individual and its members or constituents for cash, deferred payment, or other valuable consideration. Supply also includes importation of services for a consideration whether or not in the course or furtherance of business. Supply also includes supplies made without consideration, section 71C plus schedule 1. Supply excludes non-supplies under GST, section 7.2 plus schedule 3. Activities to be treated as supply of goods or supply of services. are mentioned in section 7(1)(a) and schedule 2. Supply should be of goods or services or both. Supply includes specified forms of supply, should be for a consideration, and should be in the course or furtherance of business. Supply should be of goods or services or both. The definition of supply begins with the term supply includes, thus making it clear that CGST Act intends to give an extensive meaning to the term supply. Supply includes all forms of supply of goods or services or both. Supply of anything other than goods or services like money, securities, etc. does not attract GST. So the term goods and services are defined under the CGST Act have been analyzed by way of diagram on the next page. Anything supplied other than goods or services is outside the scope of supply. So goods mean every kind of movable property, and it excludes money and securities, but includes actionable claims, growing crops, grass, and things attached to slash forming part of the land, which are agreed to be severed before supply or under a contract of supply. Services, on the other hand, mean anything other than goods. It also excludes money and securities, but includes activities relating to use of money or conversion of money by cash by any other mode from one form of currency slash denomination to another for which a separate consideration is charged. Supply includes specified forms of supply, should be for a consideration, and should be in the course of furtherance of business. The first part of section 7 includes all forms of supply of goods or services or both, such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, or disposal, made or agreed to be made for a consideration in the course or furtherance of business. So the forms of supply are sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, disposal. It is important to note that the supply includes all forms of supply within its purview, though 8 illustrative forms of supply have been enlisted in this definition. Further, supply as contemplated in this first part has two prerequisites. The supply should be for a consideration, and the supply should be in the course or furtherance of business. We shall first discuss the various forms of supply as illustrated in section 7(1)(a) in detail. Forms of supply. Various forms of supply contemplated in section 7(1)(a) are sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, or disposal. These forms of supply are only illustrative and not exhaustive. However, none of these terms have been defined under the Act. In order to understand their meaning, we have taken recourse to their dictionary meaning or otherwise sale and transfer. The dictionary meaning of the term sale is the act of selling, specifically the transfer of ownership of and title to property from one person to another person for a price. As per the Sale of Goods Act 1930, a contract of sale of goods is a contract whereby the seller transfers or agrees to transfer the property in goods to the buyer for a price. Further, the term transfer has been defined in the Black's Law Dictionary as to convey or remove from one place, person, etc. to another, pass or hand over from one to another, specifically to make over their possession or control of. Example 1. A shopkeeper sells a pen for 100 rupees to the buyer. After the sale, the pen belongs to the buyer and shopkeeper does not have any right to the pen. This is a transaction of sale. Example 2. A company transfers goods from its factory to the depot for sale. This is transfer of goods where the sale has not yet taken place. Barter and exchange. The dictionary meaning of the term barter is to exchange goods or services for other goods or services instead of using money. Black's Law Dictionary defines the term exchange as an act of giving or taking one thing for another. While barter deals with a transaction which only includes an exchange of goods or services, exchange may cover a situation where the goods are paid for partly in goods and partly in money. When there is barter of goods or services, same activity constitutes supply as well as consideration. When a new car worth 5 lakh is purchased in exchange of an old car along with the monetary consideration of 4 lakhs paid for the said purchase, this is an example of exchange transaction. Example 4. A doctor got his haircut from a barber and provides him medical consultancy in return. In this transaction, the doctor provided the medical consultancy services to the barber for which consideration was in the form of haircutting services provided by the barber. Similarly, the barber provided haircutting services to the doctor, for which consideration was in the form of medical consultancy services provided by the doctor. This is an example of barter transaction. License, lease, rental, and disposal. The dictionary meaning of the term license is a permission granted by competent authority to engage in a business or occupation or in an activity otherwise unlawful. The dictionary meaning of the term rental is an arrangement to rent something or the amount of money that you pay to rent something, and that of lease is to make a legal agreement by which money is paid in order to use land, a building, vehicle, or a piece of equipment for an agreed period of time. Black's Law Dictionary defines disposal as the sale, pledge, giving away, use, consumption, or any other disposition of a thing. Under GST, such licenses, leases, rentals of goods with or without transfer of right to use are covered under the supply of service because there is no transfer of title in such supplies. Such transactions are specifically treated as supply of service in Schedule 2 of CGST Act. As discussed earlier, one of the parameters to qualify as a supply of goods and or services is that a supply is made for a consideration. The parameter has been explicated in the following paragraphs. Consideration. The dictionary meaning of word consideration is payment. Consideration need not always be in the form of money, it can be in money or in kind. It covers anything which might be possibly done, given, or made in exchange for something else. Further, a consideration need not always flow from recipient of the supply. It can also be made by a third person. However, any subsidy given by central government or state government is not considered as consideration. A deposit given in respect of the supply of goods or services or both shall not be considered as payment made for such supply unless the supplier applies such a deposit as consideration for the said supply. The term consideration is defined under section 231. The said definition has been depicted in the form of diagram as follows. Consideration. Payment in money or otherwise for the supply. Consideration. Payment in money or otherwise for the supply. Monetary value of any act or forbearance for the supply by recipient or any other person, excluding subsidy given by central or state governments. In case of payment in money or otherwise for the supply, deposit is to be considered as payment only when the supplier applies such deposit as consideration for the said supply. Let us examine the existence of consideration in the following three scenarios. Donations received by charitable institutions from individual donors without quid pro quo. The meaning of the term quid pro quo is any obligation to do anything in return of the donation. An important feature of consideration is quid pro quo, something for something. Donations received by charitable organizations are treated as consideration only if there exists quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. There is an obligation on part of recipient of the donation or gift to do anything, supply a service. Generally, institutions such as religious institutions, charitable organizations, schools, hospitals, orphanages, old age homes receive financial help or any other support in the form of donation or gift from the individual donors. In order to express the gratitude towards such help or support, the recipient institutions place a nameplate or similar such acknowledgement in their premises. When the name of the donor is displayed in recipient's institution's premises in such a manner which can be said to be an expression of gratitude and public recognition of donor's act of philanthropy and is not aimed at giving publicity to the donor in such a manner that it would be an advertising or promotion of his business, then it can be said that there is no supply of service for the payment in the form of donation. In other words, there is no obligation on part of the recipient of the donation or gift to do anything, that is, supply a service. Therefore, there is no GST liability on such payment. Some examples of cases where there would be no taxable supply are as follows. Example 5. Bhushan donated a blackboard to Yogi Yoginisht Sansthan, a charitable yoga institution. Yoganist Sanstha printed underneath the blackboard, so donated, Good wishes from Mr. Bhushan. Srimati Durga Devi donated some money to a temple in the memory of her late father. The temple trust constructed a room in the temple complex from such donation and wrote, donated by Srimati Durga Devi in the memory of her father on the door of the room. In the above examples, it may be noticed that there is no reference or mention of any business activity of the donor which otherwise would have got advertised. Thus, GST is not leviable where the three cumulative conditions are satisfied, namely gift or donation made to a charitable organization. Payment has the character of philanthropic, that is, it leads to no commercial gain and not advertisement. Circular number 116/35 2019. Artworks sent by artists to galleries for exhibition is not a supply, as no consideration flows from the gallery to the artists. Artists give their work of art to galleries where it is exhibited for supply. However, no consideration flows from the gallery to the artist when the artworks are sent to the gallery for exhibition, and therefore the same is not a supply. It is only when a buyer selects a particular artwork displayed at the gallery that the actual supply takes place, and applicable GST would be payable at the time of such supply. No supply of service by the insured to the insurance company in lieu of no claim bonus offered by the said insurance company to him. The issue which arose for consideration was whether the deduction on account of no claim bonus allowed by the insurance company from the insurance premium payable by the insured can be considered as consideration for the supply provided by the insured to the insurance company for agreeing to the obligation to refrain from the act of lodging insurance claim during the previous years. As per practice prevailing in the insurance sector, the insurance companies deduct no claim bonus from the gross insurance premium amount when no claim is made by the insured person during the previous insurance periods. The customer slash insured procures insurance policy to indemnify himself from any loss, injury, as per the terms of the policy, and is not under any contractual obligation not to claim insurance claim during any period covered under this policy in lieu of NCB. It is therefore clarified that there is no supply provided by the insured to the insurance company in form of agreeing to the obligation to refrain from the act of lodging insurance claim during the previous years, and NCB cannot be considered as a consideration for any supply provided by the insured to the insurance company. Salvage wreck earmarked in claim assessment of damage caused to motor vehicle. In case of motor vehicle insurance provided by insurance companies engaged in providing general insurance services, such companies insure the cost of repairs or damages of motor vehicles incurred by the policyholders. In case a claim is made by an insurer for damage of motor vehicle terms of the insurance contract, deduct the value of salvage wreckage of the motor vehicle as deductibles from the claim amount paid to the insured, and the insured and insurance company are not liable to discharge, or they do not deduct the value of salvage motor vehicle and pay the full amount of insurance claim, the salvage becomes the property of the insurance company, and the insurance company will be obligated to discharge GST on salvage of to the salvage buyer. Any transaction involving supply of goods or services without consideration is not a supply unless it is deemed to be supply under law in Schedule 1 of the CGST Act. Another parameter to qualify as supply or services is that a supply is made in course or furtherance of business. This parameter has been explained in the following paras. Course or furtherance of business. GST is essentially a tax only on commercial transactions. However, only those supplies that are in the course or furtherance of business qualify as supply under GST. Resultantly, any supplies made by an individual in his personal capacity do not come under the ambit of GST unless they fall within the definition of business. Meaning of supply in the course or furtherance of business. Any activity undertaken in course or furtherance of business would constitute a supply. In order to understand the term in the course or furtherance of under section 217 inter alia, any trade, commerce, manufacture, profession, vocation, whether or not undertaken for a monetary benefit. The definition of business has been summarized in the diagram below. Any trade, commerce, manufacture, profession, even if there is no monetary benefit. So, any activity incidental or ancillary to it, any activity of same nature even if no volume or continuity. Business also includes supply or acquisition of goods, including capital goods and services, in connection with commencement or closure of business. Business includes provision of facilities by club or association to its members for consideration. Business includes admission for consideration to any premises. It includes services as holder of office, accepted in course or furtherance of trade profession. Activities of race club, including by way of totalizator or a license to bookmaker or activities of a licensed bookmaker in such club. Any activity by government, local. Thus, business includes any transaction, any activity or transaction which is incidental to any trade, commerce, manufacture, profession, vocation, any other similar activity. In order, any activity undertaken by the central government or state government or any local authority in which they are engaged as public authority shall also be constituted as business. For any trade, commerce, or any other similar activity to qualify as business, frequency, volume, continuity, regularity of such transaction is not a prerequisite. Some of the examples of supply made or not made in the course or furtherance of business are as follows. Rishabh buys a car for his personal use and after a year sells it to car dealer. Sale of car by Rishabh to car dealer is not a supply under CGST because the said supply is not made by Rishabh in the course or furtherance of business. Manikarnika sold her old gold bangles and earrings to Abhushan Jewelers. Sale of old gold jewelry by an individual to a jeweler will not constitute supply as it is not in the course or furtherance of business. Since business includes vocation, therefore supply of goods or services as a vocation is also supply under GST. Sundaram Acharya, a famous actor, paints some paintings and sells them. The consideration from such sale is to be donated to a charitable trust, Kind Human. The sale of paintings by the actor qualifies as supplies as it is made in the course or furtherance of business. Facilities provided by the club or association to its members for consideration are provided in course or furtherance of business. A resident welfare association provides the service of depositing the electricity bills of the residents in lieu of some nominal charges. Provision of service by a club or association or society to its members is included in the definition of business. Admission of persons to any premises for a consideration is also included in business. Services by way of admission to circus, cinema halls, amusement parks, including theme parks, water parks, are considered as supply as these are services by way of admissions of persons to any premises for any consideration. Business includes activities of a rest club, including by way of totalizator or a licensed bookmaker or activities of a licensed bookmaker in such club. Royal Turf Racing Club is engaged in facilitating the wagering transactions on horses placed through totalizator. For providing the service of facilitating wagering transactions, Royal Turf gets a commission which is deducted and retained by the club from the total bet value. Said services amount to supply as the activities of race club are included in business. There is one exception to the course or furtherance of business rule, that is import of services for a consideration. ABC said activity or transaction qualifies as supply under GST. After understanding the basic concept of supply, let us now examine taxability of few transactions. Taxability of cost petroleum. When an oil exploration and production contractor gets a license lease to explore mine the petroleum crude and or natural gas from the government, it enters into a production sharing contract with the government. The relationship of the contractors with the government is not that of partners. Expenses incurred in exploration, development, production, and payment of royalty, involved in the extraction of oil or gas from the total sale proceeds, and thereafter he is expected to share with the government the profit from his venture, known as profit petroleum, as per the production sharing contract. The value of petroleum which the contractor is entitled to take in a year for recovery of the contract cost is called cost petroleum. Further, the total value of petroleum produced and saved from the contract area in a particular period, as reduced by cost petroleum, is called profit petroleum. The government share of profit petroleum, which is a consideration paid by the contractor to the central government for the services of grant of license lease to explore mine, petroleum, crude, and natural gas is exempt from GST. The cost petroleum is not a consideration received by the contractor for the services provided to government and thus not taxable per se. The reason for the same is that the contractors carry exploration and production of petroleum for themselves and not as a service to government. They had acquired the right to explore, exploit, and sell petroleum in lieu of royalty and a share in profit petroleum. Okay. Financial transactions. Banks and financial institutions provide a bouquet of financial services relating to lending or borrowing of money or investment in money and any other related services. For such services, invariably, a variety of transactions are used in the financial markets. In the following paras, we have examined whether transactions in such instruments qualify as supply. As seen earlier, the definitions of goods and services specifically exclude both money and securities. The definition of money includes instruments like checks, drafts, pay orders, promissory notes, letter of credits, etc. Therefore, activities that are only transactions in such instruments would be outside the definition of service. Money would also include transactions in commercial paper and certificate of deposits, as they are in the nature of promissory notes, issuance of drafts or letters of credit, etc. While these transactions are outside the ambit of supply, the related activity for which a separate consideration is charged is chargeable to GST if other elements of taxability are present. The term securities shall have the same meaning as assigned to it in the Securities Contract Act. In this regard, there may arise a doubt as to whether a derivative is included within the meaning of securities. Before that, let us understand what a derivative means in simple terms. Derivatives are financial contract or instruments that derive their value from something else like an underlying asset. They are kind of bets or agreements based on the price or performance of the underlying asset rather than owning the asset directly. Derivatives are included in the definition of securities under SCRA. As derivatives fall in the definition of securities, they are neither goods nor services and hence not liable to GST. Two most common types of derivatives are futures contracts and forward contracts. In simple terms, forward and futures contracts are similar to making a promise to buy or sell something like a commodity, financial asset, or even a market index at a specific price on a future date. It's an agreement slash contract between two parties to buy or sell that something at a specific price on a specific date in the future. On the specified date in future, the contract needs to be settled. These contracts can either be settled by way of actual physical delivery of the underlying asset or via net settlement. The primary difference between the futures and forward contracts is that futures contracts are standardized derivative contracts traded on organized exchanges and marked to market daily, whereas forward contracts are customizable over the counter derivative contracts are not traded on recognized exchanges but negotiated between two parties without any daily mark to market requirements. GST implications on futures contracts. Since future contracts are in the nature of derivatives, these qualify as securities and thus are not subject to GST. However, where the futures contracts have a delivery option and the settlement of contract takes place by way of actual delivery of underlying commodity, then such futures contracts would be treated as normal supply of goods and liable to GST. GST implications of forward contracts, where the settlement takes place by way of actual delivery of underlying commodity, then such forward contracts would be treated as normal supply of goods and liable to GST. When the settlement takes place by way of net settlement, uh, over the prevailing over with the differential of market rate sorry forward rate over the prevailing market rate on the settlement date, the same would be falling within the purview of securities and thus not chargeable to GST implications on secured debt. Sale, purchase, acquisition, or assignment of a secured debt does not constitute a transaction in money. It is in the nature of derivative and hence a security. GST implications on transactions in instruments. Transactions in instruments like interest rate swaps, foreign exchange swaps would be excluded from the definition of supply since such instruments are derivatives, being securities based on the contract of difference. GST implications on service by way of extending deposits, loans, or advances. Services by way of extending deposit, loans, or advances, insofar as the consideration is represented by way of interest or discount, is exempt from the levy of GST. It is important to note that GST would be levied on service charges normally charged for various transactions in money, including charges for making drafts, issuance charges for letter of credit, etc., or service charges or service fees or documentation fees, or broking charges or such like fees or charges charged on the derivatives, future contracts, forward contracts, since the same would be a consideration for provision of service. Lending of securities lending scheme. Securities and Exchange Board of India has prescribed the Securities Lending Scheme 1997 for the purpose of facilitating lending and borrowing of securities. The security lending mechanism is depicted in the diagram below. Lender sends his securities to the approved intermediary then sends the securities to the borrower. In the above diagram, lender is a person who deposits the securities registered in his name or in the name of any other person duly authorized on his behalf with an approved intermediary for the purpose of lending under the scheme. Borrower is the person who borrows the securities under the scheme through an approved intermediary. Approved intermediary is a person duly registered by the SEBI under the securities lending scheme, through whom the lender will deposit the securities for lending and the borrower will borrow the securities. Under this scheme, the lender of securities lends securities through an approved intermediary to a borrower under an agreement temporarily for a specified window. The lender earns lending fee for lending the securities to the borrower. Securities are lent with the condition that the borrower will return equivalent securities of the same type or class at the end of the specified period, along with the corporate benefits accruing on the securities borrowed. The borrower of securities can further sell or buy these securities. In order to lend securities under SLS, lender enters into an agreement with the approved intermediary. And for the purpose of borrowing of securities, the borrower enters into an agreement with the approved intermediary. Thus, there is no direct agreement between the lender and borrower for the lending or borrowing of securities, and there is anonymity between them. The transaction takes place through an electronic screen based order matching mechanism provided by the recognized stock exchange in India. As seen earlier in this chapter, securities are neither covered in the definition of goods nor covered in the definition of services. Therefore, a transaction in securities which involves disposal of securities is not a supply in GST and hence not taxable. The SLS doesn't treat lending of securities as disposal of securities and therefore is not excluded from the definition of services. The lending fee charged from the borrowers or securities has the character of consideration and is taxable under GST. Apart from above, the activities of the intermediaries facilitating lending and borrowing of securities for commission or fee is also taxable separately. Securities of subsidiary company in holding company. Since securities are considered neither as goods nor as services, securities held by holding company in the subsidiary company are neither goods nor services. Further, the purchase or sale of shares of securities in itself is neither a supply of goods nor a supply of service. Merely because there is an entry in the scheme of classification of services to that effect, the activity of holding of shares of subsidiary companies by the holding company per se cannot be treated as supply of services by a holding company to the said subsidiary company unless there is a supply of services by the holding company to the subsidiary company in accordance with section 7. Cash calls in joint venture. JV being an unincorporated temporary association constituted for the term limited purpose of carrying out a specified project within a time frame. Whether a cash call is merely a transaction in money or in the nature of consideration for taxable service would depend on the terms of the joint venture agreement, which may vary from case to case. Cash calls are raised by an operating member of the joint venture on other members in proportion to their participating interest in the joint venture. to meet the expenditure on the operations to be carried out as per the approved work program and budget. Let us understand the taxability of cash calls with the help of the following examples. There are four members in a JV, including the operating member, and each one contributes 100 rupees as part of the share. A total amount of 400 is collected. The operating member purchases machinery for 400 for the JV to be used in oil production. In the above case, cash calls will not be subject to GST since the operating member is not carrying out any activity for another for consideration. Here, the money paid for purchase of machinery is merely in the nature of capital contribution and is therefore a transaction in money. Example 14. There are four members in the JV, including operating member, and each one contributes 100 as part of the share. A total amount of 400 is collected. The operating member thereafter uses its own machinery and performs exploration and production activities on behalf of the JV. In the above case, the operating member uses his own machinery and is therefore providing service within the scope of supply because here operating member is recovering the cost appropriating towards machinery and services from other JV members in their participating interest ratio. In the subsequent paras, we have discussed the exceptions to the above two parameters of supply, namely supply made for a consideration but not in the course or furtherance of business, and supply made without consideration. Importation of services for consideration whether or not in the course or furtherance of business. The connotation of supply gets expanded significantly through the second part of section 7, that is 7.1b, which brings within the ambit of supply the importation of services for a consideration whether or not in the course or furtherance of business. This is the only exception to the condition of supply made in the course or furtherance of business. Example: Ramaiah, a proprietor, has received the architect services for his personal residence from an architect located in New York at an agreed consideration of $5,000. The import of services by Ramaiah is supply under 7.1b, though it is not in the course or furtherance of business. Activities without consideration deemed supply. Statutory provisions. Schedule 1, Para 1. Permanent transfer or disposal of business assets where input tax credit has been availed of such assets. Para 2. Supply of goods or services or both between related persons or between distinct persons as specified in section 25 when made in the course or furtherance of business, provided that gifts not exceeding 50,000 rupees in value in a financial year by an employer to an employee shall not be treated as supply of goods or services or both. Para 3. Supply of goods by a principal to his agent where the agent undertakes to supply such goods on behalf of the principal. By an agent, supply of goods by an agent to his principal where the agent undertakes to receive such goods on behalf of the principal. Para 4. Import of services by a person from a related person or from any one of his establishments outside India in the course or furtherance of business. Analysis. As seen earlier, Section 7.1c provides that supply includes the activities specified in Schedule 1, made or agreed to be made without a consideration. Thus, where activities or transactions which are treated as supply, even if they are made without consideration, these are specifically mentioned in Schedule 1, appended to the CGST Act. The same has been discussed in subsequent paras. As per Schedule 1, in the following four cases, activities made without consideration will be treated as supply under Section 7. Permanent transfer or disposal of business assets, para 1 of Schedule 1. Any kind of disposal or transfer of business assets made by an entity or on permanent basis, even though without consideration, qualifies as supply. However, this provision shall apply only if input tax credit has been availed on such assets. Therefore, in order to qualify as supply under this para, following conditions need to be satisfied. There must be disposal or transfer of business assets. Transfer or disposal must be permanent. ITC must have been availed on such business assets. In view of the last condition stipulated above, permanent transfer or disposal of following business assets without consideration will not be covered within this para and thus will not be deemed as supply. Business assets on which ITC is blocked, not available under GST. Business assets though eligible for ITC, ITC has not been availed by the registered person. It's important to note that under GST legislation, there is no specific definition for the term business asset. Nevertheless, business assets are generally recognized as property, plant, and equipment, primarily for business purpose. These assets can be grouped into various categories, including current, non current, short term, long term, operating, and capitalized, as well as tangible and intangible. Example 16. Dhruv gives old laptops being used in his business to his friends free of cost. This will qualify as supply provided input tax credit has been availed by Dhruv on such laptops. A dealer of AC permanently transfers the motor vehicle free of cost. ITC on said motor vehicle is blocked. The transaction will not constitute a supply as the condition of availment of ITC on the business asset transferred is not fulfilled. The para is wide enough to cover transfer of business assets from holding to subsidiary company for a nil consideration. Supply between related persons. Okay, we'll take this on the next session. That will be it for now. Let's pause the timer. 46:43.